On January 28, 2026, a group of farmers filed a lawsuit containing a single devastating number: $500. That was the fee per railcar a railroad charged not to ship their grain, a paper barrier erected to cut them off from the entire West Coast market. This is the story of what happened when a railroad tried to strangle a harvest and the farmers who decided to fight back in court. That fee was a legal blockade. It trapped millions of bushels of wheat and corn in the high plains, with the harvest in and the bills coming due. The plaintiffs were 13 farm families from Kansas and Colorado. The defendants were railroad giants Union Pacific in Kansas and Oklahoma. This was a fight over the oldest question in American agriculture: what happens when the only road to market belongs to someone who wants you to fail? To understand why $500 was a death sentence, you have to understand the land. Western Kansas and eastern Colorado are a sea of wheat and corn, but it's an island on the map. No navigable rivers, no major highways built for 1,000-bushel grain trucks. For over a century, the only economic lifeline out was rail. Specifically, 122 miles of track called the Towner Line. It ran east-west, a direct shot to the main Union Pacific transcontinental artery. For generations, it carried their harvest to Pacific ports. Then it was killed by neglect. By the late 1990s, the line's owner had stopped maintaining it. Weeds grew between the ties, rails warped, bridges were declared unsafe. The last grain train ran in 1996. For the next 20 years, the Towner Line was a rusting scar on the prairie and the farmers were trapped. They still had one outlet, but it was a geographic absurdity. The only remaining route forced grain to travel east, 140 miles east, away from the Pacific, to the city of Great Bend, Kansas, just to interchange onto a Union Pacific line that would then turn around and head west. That detour added over 280 round-trip rail miles and up to 2 weeks to every shipment. The cost was baked into every low price they got at the elevator. They were captives, and everyone knew it. This is where our first key player enters. Not a farmer, but a businessman who saw the captivity as an opportunity: Stefan Soloviv. His family conglomerate, the Soloviv Group, owned Wagon Grain, a major elevator operator in the region. He watched his own company pay the inflated freight costs. In early 2018, he decided to buy the corpse of the Towner Line. He formed the Colorado Pacific Railroad and spent millions rehabilitating those 122 miles of track: new ties, new rail, repaired bridges. By harvest 2018, the line was operational for the first time in over 2 decades. He wasn't just a railroad owner, he was a grain buyer. His incentive was perfectly aligned with the farmers. Lower shipping costs meant he could pay them more, attract more business, and ship more grain. For the first time in a generation, there was hope for competition. But the Towner Line had a fatal flaw: it was a stub line. It dead-ended into another, much larger railroad. The Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad, known as K&O and K&O, had a lease agreement with the giant Union Pacific. To reach the main Union Pacific network, a grain car from the Towner Line had to travel a short distance, just miles, on K&O tracks before connecting to UP. That connection point was the chokehold. The lease between Union Pacific and Kansas and Oklahoma was signed back in 1997. It was a standard document, or so everyone thought. It governed the terms of how traffic interchanged between the two railroads. Buried in its pages was a provision about setting interchange fees. For 20 years, it didn't matter. The Towner Line was dead. But in 2019, something changed. According to the lawsuit, executives from Union Pacific and Kansas and Oklahoma met. The revived Towner Line was a threat. It could siphon off millions of tons of lucrative westbound grain from UP's monopoly route. So they allegedly made a secret amendment to that 1997 lease. They added a new fee, an interchange fee specifically for traffic originating on the Towner Line. The fee was not based on costs. It was not a reasonable charge for moving a car a few miles. It was set at $500.12 per railcar. To understand the brutality of that number, consider the math. The average railcar holds about 110 tons of wheat. The total freight rate to ship that car to the West Coast might be around $3,000. That $500 fee was a 16% tax, applied before the grain even began its real journey. It made the Towner line route instantly, completely non-competitive. It was a paper barrier. The tracks were physically connected. The hopper cars could roll freely. But a clause in a contract, invisible to the farmers, made it commercially impossible. No westbound grain car would ever move that way again. The railroad had found a way to close the crossing without ever touching a piece of machinery. They simply wrote the closure into a contract. And for the farmers watching the newly repaired tracks outside their fields, the silence was deafening. The trains never came. The prices at the elevator didn't improve. The captivity was now tighter than ever, enforced not by rust but by fine print. The harvest of 2019 came in, then 2020, then 2021. Each year the grain flowed east, then west, and the hidden tax was paid. The farmers knew they were being screwed. They could feel it in the stagnant prices, but they had no idea how. They blamed the markets. They blamed the weather. They blamed themselves, until one of them, quite by accident, found the piece of paper that changed everything. The farmer's name was Mark Sanders, and the reason he was looking at railroad contracts in the first place went back to a conversation in 1989 in a farmhouse outside Scott City, Kansas, where his own father lost a fortune not to drought, but to a clause. Mark was born in 1966. His family had farmed the same section of land for 3 generations. His father, Walter, was a meticulous man. He tested his soil every fall, calibrated his planter to the inch, and kept ledgers in perfect penmanship. But like most farmers of his era, Walter had a blind spot. He believed a deal was a handshake. The written contract was just a formality for the lawyers. In the mid-'80s, Walter entered into a deal with a local grain elevator that had a side business in railcar leasing. The terms were simple. Walter would get priority access to railcars during harvest at a fixed rate. He signed the 3-page agreement without reading past the first page. Buried on page 2 was a liability clause. It stated that if the elevator failed to provide a car for any reason, the farmer's sole remedy was a refund of the lease fee. It did not cover the consequential damages, the cost of storing the grain, the price drop if harvest was missed, the penalties for failing to deliver to the Pacific buyer. In 1989, a logistics snafu at the elevator left Walter without cars for 3 critical weeks. The harvest sat in bins. The price of wheat fell 12%. Walter lost over $30,000. He went to the elevator manager, a man he'd known for 20 years, expecting to be made whole. The manager pointed to the clause. "My hands are tied, Walt. It's right here in the contract you signed." Walter Sanders never recovered from the shock. It wasn't the money. It was the betrayal by the paper. He trusted a neighbor, and the paper had allowed that neighbor to hide behind it. Mark was 23. He watched his father's spirit break. That night he dug the contract out of the filing cabinet and read it, every word. The legal language was dense, but the trap was clear. From that day forward, Mark Sanders read everything. Every seed agreement, every fertilizer contract, every grain marketing forward contract. He became, in the words of his local banker, painfully thorough. So, in 2021, when Stefan Soloviv's Colorado Pacific Railroad started quietly asking farmers for support in a regulatory filing about interchange issues, Mark didn't just sign a letter. He asked for the filing. He read the 70-page submission to the Surface Transportation Board, and on page 48 he found a footnote. It referenced an amended lease agreement between Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad and Union Pacific, dated 2019. The footnote suggested the amendment imposed a restrictive interchange fee on Towner line traffic. Mark Sanders didn't know what that meant, but he knew footnotes were where they buried the bad news. He called the Colorado Pacific. He asked for a copy of the amended lease. At first, they refused. It was confidential, they said, a proprietary business document. Mark persisted. He argued that as a shipper whose livelihood depended on that interchange, he had a right to understand the barriers. After weeks of pressure, a PDF arrived in his email. It was the 1997 lease with a handful of pages marked Revised 2019. He scrolled to the revision, and there it was. Section 4, Paragraph C, Subparagraph 2. For all traffic originating on the Towner line segment and interchanging to up via K and O, an additional interchange fee of $500.12 per car shall apply. He read it 3 times. The simplicity was breathtaking. It wasn't a complex tariff. It was a single sentence, a surgical strike. He called his neighbor, a farmer named David Compton. David, they've got a toll booth. On paper. They're charging us over $500 a car just for the right to use the tracks they already fixed. David was silent for a long moment. That's why the trains never came. Exactly. The physical barrier was gone. The legal barrier was designed to be just as absolute. Mark and David started making calls. They called the other farms listed in the Salaviv filing. They called Wagon Grain. They pieced the story together. The fee had been in place since 2019. It had never been publicly filed as a tariff. It was a private contract between 2 railroads, a secret tax on an entire region. The farmers arranged a meeting in the community hall in Sharon Springs, Kansas. 13 operations showed up. Men and women who represented thousands of acres and generations of history. A lawyer from the Colorado Pacific was there to explain. He laid out the brutal economics. With the fee, shipping via the Towner line cost more than the old, circuitous eastern route. Therefore, no grain buyer would ever choose it. The railroad had created a perfectly legal monopoly. One of the older farmers, Lenny Heineman, leaned forward. So let me get this straight. They own the tracks to the east and they don't want competition from the tracks to the west. So they put a price on the connection to make sure no one uses it. Yes, and they can do that. The lawyer paused. The law governing these agreements is murky. There's a concept called bottleneck rate making. But this isn't about rates. It's about an access fee in a private contract. It's a gray area they're exploiting. Mark Sanders spoke up. It's not gray, it's black and white. They wrote a clause to kill competition. They decided our harvest wasn't allowed to take the shortest path to market. The room felt it. This wasn't an act of God. It wasn't market forces. It was a deliberate, calculated decision made in a boardroom. The question was, what could they do about it? They could complain to the Surface Transportation Board, the federal regulator, but that process took years, and the board had a history of siding with railroads. They could try to negotiate, but they had no leverage. They were 13 families against $2 billion corporations. Then Stefan Salaviv made an offer. His company, Wagon Grain, would join them. So would his railroad, the Colorado Pacific. They would file an antitrust lawsuit together. He would front the legal costs. The farmers would be the plaintiffs. Their names would be on the complaint. It was a staggering risk. Suing Union Pacific was like suing a force of nature. The legal fees alone could bankrupt them if they lost. The railroads could retaliate in 100 subtle ways with shipping delays and equipment shortages. They would be painting a target on their backs. But the alternative was to accept the captivity, to keep paying the hidden tax forever, to let a paragraph in a contract dictate the value of their land and the future of their children. They took a vote. All 13 agreed. They would sue. The lawsuit was drafted in the closing months of 2025. It alleged a conspiracy to restrain trade in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It named the $500 fee as the smoking gun. The complaint was filed in federal court in Kansas on January 28, 2026. The news release went out. For the first time, the secret amendment was a public document. The railroads now had 30 days to respond. The farmers waited. They expected a fierce denial, a motion to dismiss. What they got was something far more cunning. The railroads didn't argue the fee was reasonable. They didn't deny the amendment existed. Their argument was much simpler and much more dangerous. They said the farmers had no right to sue in the first place. Their lawyers filed a motion to dismiss. The argument was a masterpiece of legal cynicism. The railroads claimed that the 13 farmers and even Wagon Grain were not direct purchasers of the rail service and therefore had no legal standing to bring an antitrust claim. They argued that the farmers sold grain to an elevator. The elevator arranged and paid for the freight. Therefore, any overcharge was absorbed by the middleman. The farmers, they said, were at best indirect victims, too far removed from the transaction to sue. It was a technicality designed to kill the case before it ever reached the evidence. If it succeeded, the secret fee would remain forever unchallenged. The farmers' legal team scrambled. They had to prove the economic chain was direct, that the $500 fee was instantly deducted from the price they received at the scale. They gathered years of settlement sheets from Wagon Grain. They hired an agricultural economist to model the price suppression. It was a race against the court calendar. And then, the second shoe dropped. While the farmers were fighting for the right to have their day in court, the railroads made a move that threatened to make the entire lawsuit irrelevant. Union Pacific announced a proposed merger with Norfolk Southern, the creation of a mega railroad. The American Farm Bureau Federation immediately sounded the alarm. Their analysis was stark. This merger would leave 85% of the country's grain-producing regions with only one Class I railroad option. For the farmers in Kansas and Colorado, it was an existential threat. If UP merged with NS, the combined behemoth would control not just the eastern route, but potentially the entire competitive landscape. Any hope of future alternative routes would vanish. Their captivity would become permanent. The proposed merger sent a shockwave through the entire agricultural economy. Projections showed transportation and marketing costs rising to a record $14 billion in 2026. The merger proceedings became a new, colossal battlefield. The farmers had to fight on two fronts: their private antitrust lawsuit and a public regulatory war against the merger. They filed interventions with the Surface Transportation Board. They gave testimony. They told their story of the paper barrier as a case study of what happens when railroad competition dies. And then, a miracle. On January 7, 2026, just 3 weeks before the farmers filed their lawsuit, the Surface Transportation Board did something it hadn't done in 40 years. It unanimously proposed a major rule change. The new rule targeted bottleneck situations exactly like the Towner line. Under the old rules, shippers had to prove specific, blatant anti-competitive conduct, a nearly impossible bar. The new proposal sought to remove that burden. It would allow the board to grant competitive access simply if it was in the public interest. The timing was either incredible luck or the result of decades of pressure finally breaking through. For the farmers, it was a potential game changer. Their case was no longer just about a single fee. It was now a test case for a new regulatory philosophy. If they won, they wouldn't just reopen their line. They could set a precedent that would unlock captive shippers across the country. The stakes had escalated from their harvest to the entire national rail system. The railroads, sensing the shift, went on the offensive. In their public comments on the merger, they dismissed the farmers' concerns. They argued the market was competitive. They pointed to trucks as an alternative, ignoring the fact that trucking grain hundreds of miles to a port was economically impossible. In private legal filings, they attacked the farmers personally. They painted them as pawns of a disgruntled billionaire, Stefan Soliviv, who was just using them to gain a competitive edge for his own grain company. They argued the $500 fee was a legitimate business negotiation, not a conspiracy. The pressure on the 13 farm families intensified. Banking relationships grew frosty. Equipment leases came up for renewal with sudden, stringent new terms. The community, once united, began to fray under the strain. Some neighbors, afraid of retaliation, quietly distanced themselves. At a county co-op meeting, one farmer confronted Mark Sanders. "You're rocking the boat for everyone. What if they just stop serving our elevator altogether because of your lawsuit?" Mark didn't have an answer. That was the terror of a monopoly. You couldn't fight it without fearing it would crush you entirely. In the spring of 2026, the judge in the antitrust case heard arguments on the motion to dismiss. The farmer's lawyer stood before the court and held up a single sheet of paper, a grain settlement ticket from Wagon Grain to the Heineman Ranch. He pointed to the line item deduction for freight. "This is the $500 fee, Your Honor. It is itemized." It is deducted directly from the farmer's proceeds. It is not absorbed by the elevator. It is passed through cent for cent. This farmer is the ultimate payer. This farmer has standing. The railroad's lawyer argued that the pass-through was voluntary, a business decision by the elevator, that the farmer could, in theory, sell to someone else. The judge listened, asked pointed questions, and took the matter under advisement. For the farmers, the wait was agony. The entire case, 2 years of gathering evidence, hung on this one procedural decision. If the judge ruled they lacked standing, the lawsuit died, the fee stayed, the merger would likely proceed, and the paper barrier would become a permanent feature of the landscape, a monument to their defeat. They had bet everything on the belief that the system would see the injustice. Now they had to wait for a single person in a black robe to tell them if they were even allowed to be heard. And as they waited, the harvest of 2026 began. The wheat was ready. The bins were full. And the only route to market was the long, costly detour to the east, while the direct route to the west sat silent, held hostage by a paragraph in a contract. The clock was ticking and the bills were coming due. The ruling came down on a Friday afternoon in August of 2026. The judge denied the railroad's motion to dismiss. In a 22-page order, she wrote that the farmers had plausibly alleged a direct injury. The $500 fee was a targeted tax on their harvest, and they had the right to try to prove it in court. The case would proceed to discovery. Mark Sanders got the call from their lawyer in his tractor. He shut off the engine in the middle of the field and just sat there, listening to the silence. They were in. The lawsuit was alive. The immediate effect was not a train on the tracks, but a shift in leverage. The railroads could no longer ignore them. They had to open their books. They had to turn over internal emails about the 2019 amendment. They had to sit for depositions. The discovery process was a war of attrition. The railroads buried the plaintiffs in millions of pages of documents. But within that mountain, the farmers' legal team found the treasure. They found the internal memo from a Kansas and Oklahoma railroad vice president to a Union Pacific counterpart, dated March 21, 2019. The subject line was Towner Line Competitive Threat. The text read, and I'm quoting directly here, "The Soloviev reactivation project will divert significant westbound grain volume from our shared route. The amended lease fee must be set at a level that makes their routing economically non-viable. A $500 per car threshold should achieve this objective." It was the smoking gun. The intent was not to cover costs. It was to kill a competitor. With that memo in hand, the farmers' legal team did two things. First, they filed it with the court as evidence of anti-competitive intent. Second, they sent a copy to the Surface Transportation Board, which was still reviewing both the proposed merger and its new bottleneck rule. The memo changed everything. It was no longer a dry contract dispute. It was a documented conspiracy. The pressure on the railroads became immense. Regulatory scrutiny intensified. Shareholders started asking questions. In February of 2027, the railroads made an offer. They wanted to settle. The terms were this: they would rescind the 2019 amendment. The $500.12 fee would be voided. They would enter into a new fair interchange agreement with Colorado Pacific Railroad. In return, the farmers would drop the antitrust lawsuit. There would be no admission of guilt, no monetary damages, just the removal of the paper barrier. The farmers held a meeting. It was the same group in the same community hall. The debate was fierce. Some wanted to take the deal. Get the tracks open, get the grain moving west. That was the original goal. Others wanted to press on to trial, to make them pay, to get a judgment that would echo for decades, to punish them for the years of lost income. In the end, they voted 12-1 in favor of the settlement, the practical one over the punitive. Opening the line was the victory. In March 2027, the settlement was finalized. The legal paper barrier was gone, but a physical one remained. No grain had moved west on the Towner Line in over 8 years. The elevators, the buyers, the logistics networks were all geared to the eastern route. Someone had to be the first to ship. To prove the route worked, Wagon Grain, Stefan Soloviev's company, made the first commitment. They booked 25 railcars for late April. The cars were delivered to the Towner line. They were loaded with wheat from the farms of the 13 plaintiffs. On a clear morning in April 2027, a Colorado Pacific locomotive coupled to the string of hoppers and began the 122-mile trip west to the interchange. There was no ceremony, no news crews, just the sound of wheels on rails that had been silent for a generation. The cars rolled onto the Kansas and Oklahoma track, traveled the few miles to the Union Pacific connection, and were handed over without a $500 penalty. They proceeded to Portland. The route was open. The economic effect was not instantaneous, but it was measurable. Within months, the basis, the local price compared to the futures market, tightened. Farmers were offered a few more cents per bushel. It wasn't a fortune, but it was the first positive market signal they'd seen in a decade. It was proof that competition, even the threat of it, works. Meanwhile, the larger battle continued. The Surface Transportation Board, armed with the smoking gun, memo, and public pressure, moved forward with its new bottleneck rule. It was finalized in late 2027. The rule established that where a shipper is captive to a single railroad for a portion of a route, that railroad must provide competitive access to a connecting line if it's in the public interest. The Towner line case became the textbook example cited in the rule's preamble. The farmers' lawsuit had not just freed their own grain, it had helped change the rules for every captive shipper in America. As for the merger, the story ends differently. Facing unprecedented regulatory resistance and the specter of the new bottleneck rule, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern abandoned their merger plans in early 2028. The Farm Bureau's warning had been heeded. The creation of a mega railroad was, for the moment, stopped. Now, let me tell you about the surprising detail, the one that brings this story full circle. During discovery, the farmers' lawyers found another document. It was an internal Union Pacific audit of the Kansas and Oklahoma lease. The audit questioned the legality of the 2019 amendment. It warned that imposing a fee designed to eliminate competition could be seen as a violation of the railroad's common carrier obligation. The date on that audit was November 15, 2018, 4 months before the secret amendment was even signed. The railroads knew it was legally dubious. They did it anyway. They bet that no one would ever find out, that no farmer would ever read the contract. They lost that bet because of a farmer who, 37 years earlier, had watched his father lose everything to a clause he didn't read. Mark Sanders still has that audit memo printed out. It's in a file in his farm office, next to the settlement agreement that voided the $500 fee. He calls it his insurance policy. The story doesn't end with a parade. It ends with a quiet season. The harvest of 2028 moved west on the Towner line. The trains run regularly now. The paper barrier is gone, but the memory of it isn't. The farmers are still captive to a railroad, but now there's a second track out of town, and the law has been reminded to watch the junction. The 13 plaintiffs still farm. Their names are on a legal precedent that will outlive them. They didn't get rich. They didn't get revenge. They got a fair shot. And in the high plains, where the weather and the markets are never fair, that's the only victory that matters. So let me ask you a question and take your time with it. In your life, in your work, what is the $500 fee? What is the clause, the rule, the quiet agreement that someone else wrote to keep you on the longer, costlier path? The one you haven't read because you were told it's standard, or because you trusted the handshake, or because the document was too thick and the print too small. This story isn't just about railroads and wheat. It's about the architecture of captivity. How systems are designed to make the unfair route feel inevitable. The farmers didn't win because they were stronger than a railroad. They won because they became literate in the language of their own captivity. They read the document, they traced the money, they named the fee, and in doing so, they changed the rule for everyone. The law doesn't protect the trusting, it protects the specific. The specific clause, the specific number, the specific intent. The difference between losing your land and keeping it, between a silent track and a moving train, between captivity and a fair shot, is often a single sentence on a page you were never meant to see. The paper barrier still exists in 1,000 forms, in non-compete agreements, in binding arbitration clauses, in terms of service, in lease agreements, in financing contracts. The question is never whether the barrier exists. The question is whether you'll read the document that builds it. Mark Sanders still has that file. The memo, the settlement, the old contract. He keeps it because the fight is never over. The paper is patient. It can wait for you to look away. So look, read the page, find the number. And if you're ever told that the only road to market is the long one, remember the 13 farmers who found the sentence that closed the shortcut and the sentence that opened it again. Thanks for watching.